Imagine waking up and feeling like your bedroom suddenly expanded into a cathedral, or your own hand shrank to toy size. Now here's the strange part. You know it isn't real. If you've had uncanny perceptual experiences during spiritual or fever states, you're not alone. This is Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, and recent 2025 research is offering new clues about how and where the brain produces these distortions. In this video, we'll explain the brain mechanisms in plain language, reveal why insight in AIWS makes it different from other hallucinations, and show practical ways to notice subtle perception biases shaping your choices. By the end, you'll see 3 ways perception can mislead your decisions, and 1 simple habit that reduces that risk. So before we explore specific cases of Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, let's pause on something important. How much you trust what your senses are telling you. Why perception isn't reality. Most people assume their senses deliver an accurate picture of the world. You see a cup on the table, you pick it up, and you trust that the shape, weight, and size you perceive match reality. Vision keeps rooms stable, hearing aligns with sound sources, and your awareness of body position feels steady. Yet, as Alice in Wonderland Syndrome shows, the systems that anchor this stability can create vivid distortions, convincing experiences that demonstrate how much of reality is actively constructed by the brain rather than simply recorded. Take one common report from a child with AIWS. A television suddenly appeared upside down, while the windows in the same room seemed to tilt into impossible angles. The scene corrected itself after moments, but during the episode, it carried the same immediate impact as any ordinary perception. Patients often describe such moments not as confusion, but as briefly living inside a skewed, alternate version of their familiar environment. Many retain awareness that what they are experiencing does not correspond to reality. Though research also notes that while preserved insight is a hallmark feature of AIWS, it may not be present in every single case. Most documented cases occur in children. In pediatric cases, infections, especially Epstein-Barr virus, have frequently been linked as a trigger. In adults, migraines are more often implicated, and both groups can also experience isolated, unexplained episodes. The syndrome is rare, yet by watching how perceptions stretch and bend under such circumstances, researchers gain a clearer picture of how ordinary brains filter, warp, and recombine sensory signals every day. For those experiencing AIWS, the scale of distortion can be unsettling. A hallway may appear to stretch far past its true length, or an arm might briefly look cartoonishly large compared to the rest of the body. What makes these accounts so instructive isn't only their strangeness, but what they reveal about perception itself. Your brain is not a camera mapping reality with mechanical precision. It builds a working model of the world by stitching together partial data. Most of the time, that model is sufficient. Sometimes, as AIWS shows, the construction itself becomes unstable, and the brain produces a world that holds together internally, but does not match external reality. This fragile construction matters more than curiosity alone. If perception is built moment by moment, then every decision, whether stepping into traffic, investing money, or interpreting the tone of a friend, depends on the brain's framing of sensory data. Misjudgments in scale or distance are easy to notice in clinical cases like AIWS, but smaller, subtler distortions likely influence daily life all the time. The distinction between perception and belief becomes central here. In many psychiatric or neurological conditions, hallucinations erase a person's ability to question what they see or hear. In contrast, people with AIWS often experience striking mismatches, giant hands, impossible rooms, while recognizing on another level that their actual surroundings have not changed. This unusual separation between sensing and knowing creates a unique lens for researchers. It demonstrates that perception can operate independently of higher judgment, offering a rare chance to study how the mind separates raw sensation from reflective thought. Optical illusions provide a helpful comparison. In a classroom, you might see 2 equal lines with arrows that make one look longer than the other. A ruler proves otherwise, yet visually the false impression persists. Normally, these illusions remain limited to drawings or controlled experiments. AIWS places the same error processing machinery into lived spaces, furniture, walls, and even body parts. The distortions spill into entire environments, showing on a sweeping scale that your brain runs the same shortcuts and edits beyond the laboratory. Some accounts link Alice in Wonderland Syndrome back to history. Lewis Carroll, who described whimsical, changes in size in his writing, is thought to have suffered from migraines, leading some scholars to speculate that his experiences may have shaped aspects of the story. Such speculation remains tentative, but it underlines how neural quirks can influence perception and even creativity. Importantly, the rarity of AIWS should not encourage dismissal. Its small patient base makes it unusual in clinical practice, but the phenomena reveal universal features of perception in spotlight. Whether or not you face drastic distortions, your brain employs the same constructive process, assembling sensory fragments, smoothing over missing data, and enforcing coherence. AIWS magnifies this process to a degree that is impossible to ignore, but its lessons concern everyone. Researchers studying these patients often describe them not simply as clinical cases, but as opportunities to observe perception in its most flexible form. Where ordinary people misjudge the distance of train tracks that appear to converge, or see the moon exaggerated on the horizon, AIWS patients show the same perceptual shortcuts scaled into exaggerated realities. By situating the extreme alongside the ordinary, the condition highlights that perception is untrustworthy not just in rare disorders, but also in everyday judgment. All of this raises an important implication. If our brains can fabricate convincing but inaccurate worlds under certain triggers, then our daily choices rest on information that is, at baseline, only a constructed guess. The human brain edits reality constantly, usually invisibly, sometimes dramatically. Trusting perception without question risks forgetting those underlying edits. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, then, is more than a medical curiosity. It serves as a mirror, reminding us that perception and judgment do not always move in lockstep. The distortions highlight a fragile boundary, showing that awareness can resist perception, or occasionally be immersed by it. And this leads to a difficult question. When reality bends in such striking ways, why do many patients still know it isn't real? That question points us toward the next challenge: understanding how the brain can let perception go astray while leaving awareness untouched. Strange hallucinations with insight. Imagine staring at your coffee mug as it slowly seems to stretch taller than your chest, yet at the same time knowing without doubt that the mug itself hasn't changed at all. For the person experiencing Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, this isn't a dreamlike haze or a total loss of clarity. It is precisely the opposite: shocking distortions arriving with perfect awareness that they are false. If you have ever felt a fleeting shift in size or space around you, you already know how disorienting that can feel. And in AIWS, the fact that insight remains intact doesn't necessarily make the experiences easier. For many, knowing something is wrong while still seeing it happen can heighten anxiety rather than calm it. Unlike most hallucination conditions where insight may be lost, AIWS episodes often occur with preserved awareness that the experience is illusory. This sharp division between vivid perceptual change and intact judgment makes AIWS unusual. In schizophrenia, hallucinations often come stripped of doubt. Voices and figures enter experience as unquestioned facts. With hallucinogenic drugs, distorted sights and sounds usually blur into genuine belief because the evaluative systems themselves are altered. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, by contrast, highlights that the mind can resist the pull of perception. The eyes and ears may announce a false reality, yet cognition refuses to endorse it. That separation gives researchers a rare chance to study how hallucinations interact with conscious evaluation. In many psychiatric or neurological disorders, an overwhelming sensory experience erases awareness. In AIWS, however, two parallel streams coexist, one conveying sensory impossibilities, the other standing firm in reason. A hand may balloon to an absurd size, or a hallway stretch endlessly forward, but the person living through it maintains the steady conviction that their body and environment have not actually changed. One plausible explanation is that AIWS involves disruption within early sensory processing, especially visual and spatial networks, while higher-level evaluative systems remain intact. Neuroimaging studies add weight to this model. Brain scans using SPECT and fMRI have sometimes shown reduced activity in occipital regions, where visual signals first get constructed, alongside increased activity in parietal areas that map space and perspective. This imbalance might generate the distorted perceptions while leaving judgmental circuits untouched. In simple terms, the brain is sending out erroneous pictures, but its internal fact-checker continues to resist them. This dual-layer processing has major implications for how people navigate reality. Imagine two scenarios. A patient with schizophrenia walks a corridor and sees a dark figure at their side. Lacking insight, they may panic or interpret the image as a threat. A person with AIWS walking the same corridor might see the walls stretch impossibly long, but because they retain insight, they keep walking without fear of being trapped. Both situations involve faulty visuals. Only in AIWS does reasoning cut through the illusion. That balance challenges an old saying: seeing is believing. For the AIWS patient, seeing becomes doubting. Each episode underscores how the brain continuously cross-checks perception against memory, consistency, and logic. When those checks fail, as in many hallucination disorders, beliefs collapse into confusion. When the checks hold, as in AIWS, the mind separates appearance from truth. Yet experiencing this divide is not simple relief. It can feel like living in two realities at once, and that can be as distressing as the distortions themselves. For psychologists, these preserved boundaries shed light on the mechanics of consciousness. Hallucinations and delusions are often lumped together, but AIWS illustrates their difference. A hallucination is a false perception, whereas a delusion is a false belief. In AIWS, hallucinations can be intense and alarming, but delusions do not follow. This creates a natural laboratory condition for exploring how the brain prevents sensory errors from spreading into belief systems. Few other circumstances allow researchers to watch hallucinations unfold without beliefs collapsing alongside them. The neuroscience behind this split suggests multiple levels of organization. Distorted signals move upward from sensory networks, but evaluation occurs higher in association cortices, where internal coherence gets checked. Feedback loops flag contradictions between what is seen now and what experience predicts. AIWS seems to reveal that these loops remain active, giving patients both a distorted view and an intact ability to reject it. This multi-layered system may be present in all of us, but only becomes visible when perception itself goes wildly astray. These insights also matter for everyday life. Even outside of rare disorders, people constantly misperceive. We misinterpret a driver's gesture, misread a friend's expression, or misjudge the timing of traffic lights. In ordinary settings, those distortions glide through unnoticed because they're small enough to pass as truth. AIWS exaggerates the same process until it becomes undeniable. By watching its dramatic breakdowns, psychologists see the hidden architecture guiding every ordinary judgment. The lessons extend beyond medical interest. They offer a reflection on decision-making, belief systems, and even social trust. AIWS shows that separating perception from judgment is possible, that the mind can resist believing what the senses report. This is the same cognitive safeguard that keeps a driver moving forward despite visual illusions on the road, or that lets someone reject unfounded rumors despite vivid mental images. By contrast, failures of this safeguard, whether in clinical delusions or social misinformation, reveal what happens when reason no longer counters faulty input. Preserved insight in AIWS therefore provides more than comfort during episodes. It demonstrates a cognitive strength with universal importance. When thought resists even vivid distortions, behavior stays anchored to reality. When thought succumbs to sensory or emotional pressures, confusion spreads instead. In this way, AIWS becomes a striking example of how vulnerable humanity is to perceptual shifts, and how valuable it is to maintain independent judgment against them. What remains fascinating is how fragile the entire system can be. One person can walk through the world seeing accurate scale and space, while another briefly lives inside stretched rooms and distorted limbs. Yet both depend on the same delicate balance of brain circuits. Studying AIWS underscores that even a small disruption can remake perception, forcing cognition to stand guard over truth. If such instability can arise from a momentary disruption in brain signaling, it raises the next puzzle. Where do those disruptions come from? Many assume hallucinations belong only to mental illness or powerful drugs, but AIWS often appears in people struck by something far more ordinary. Before exploring those unexpected triggers, we need to ask an even stranger question. How could a simple infection set off distortions that feel like reality itself has changed? The infection trigger. When doctors began documenting Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, many assumed that its root had to be psychiatric disease or disordered brain chemistry. But one of the most repeatedly observed entry points into these bizarre distortions has been infection. Case reports spanning decades, often involving children, describe episodes of altered body size or warped surroundings following an ordinary illness. Parents sometimes recall their child recovering from a fever, only to wake one morning convinced that their bedroom had expanded into impossible proportions, or that their arms had suddenly contracted down to puppet length. Among the infections, the Epstein-Barr virus, responsible for mononucleosis, has been reported most consistently. Reviews show it as the leading post-infectious association in pediatric cases. During or just after a bout of Epstein-Barr, children have described shifts in size perception, inverted visual scenes, or auditory distortions. Importantly, Epstein-Barr is not rare. Most people encounter it at some point, though not everyone shows clear symptoms. Its frequent pairing with AIWS in the medical literature raised an unexpected possibility. A virus that normally causes swollen glands and fatigue can, in certain circumstances, precede striking perceptual errors. Other viruses have appeared in published cases as well. Instances of AIWS following influenza, varicella, Coxsackie, and even Zika infection have been noted, suggesting that the phenomenon is not confined to Epstein-Barr alone. Rather than a single viral culprit, infections in general seem capable of setting the stage for temporary malfunctions in sensory processing. The connection does not mean that every infection leads to AIWS, but it highlights one common pathway among patients who experience distortions. When researchers investigated brain function during or after these episodes, they found intriguing patterns. Small neuroimaging studies, including SPECT and fMRI reports, suggest that episodes sometimes coincide with hypoperfusion, reduced blood flow, in regions crucial for vision and spatial mapping. In one child, decreased activity appeared in the occipital lobe. In another, it was the temporal lobe. The specific site varied, but the consistent feature was that these were areas tasked with building coherent sensory scenes. This suggested that infections might not directly produce hallucinations, but instead disrupt the brain's normal circulation or signaling in ways that lead perception briefly astray. One leading hypothesis is that infections create local cortical disturbances. Immune-related inflammation or shifts in vascular tone may alter how reliably neurons in visual and associative cortices communicate. When the input to those systems is uneven, the brain's constructed model of the world becomes distorted. A table might grow taller, not because the sensory organs are damaged, but because timing and coordination in the cortical map have wavered. This account places AIWS among conditions where everyday biological stressors, not trauma or severe pathology, temporarily pull perception off course. The fact that such distortions can follow something as routine as a viral infection reframes how hallucinations are viewed. Rather than chalking them up solely to psychiatric disease or degenerate brain changes, clinicians now include immune, vascular, and infectious factors in their explanations. This perspective shifts the stigma while opening new avenues for research. If fever and inflammation can warp spatial perception, then hallucinations themselves may be a broader product of disrupted brain equilibrium, not always signs of entrenched disorder. Case descriptions bring this into focus in a human way. A teenager recovering from mono described the schoolroom as stretching above like a cavern. Another child noted the feeling that his hands had shrunk to the size of toys. In both examples, the experiences faded as the infection resolved. These accounts reinforce that the distortions, while unsettling, are often transient side effects rather than lasting rewiring of the brain. Because many conditions can mimic AIWS, evaluation typically accounts for more than infection history alone. Clinicians look at possible migraine activity, seizure disorders, or structural abnormalities before settling on AIWS. But when a child presents shortly after a viral illness, and especially with preserved insight during distortions, infections remain a leading consideration. In most pediatric cases, no invasive intervention is needed. Symptoms fade as the underlying illness clears. Supportive care, rest, and reassurance are the mainstay, so long as serious neurological disease has been excluded. Not every case can be tied to infection. Reviews of the literature note that in around 1/5 of reported episodes, no clear cause is identified at all. This adds to the sense that AIWS is not produced by a single factor, but rather emerges from a range of disturbances that interfere with perception at vulnerable points in the system. Infections are common triggers, but not exclusive ones. Migraines, epilepsy, or unexplained anomalies can equally lead to similar experiences. The overlap between such diverse origins suggests the syndrome reflects a final common pathway of perceptual disruption, not a uniform disease mechanism. The biological plausibility of Infection as one pathway remains strong. Infections provoke immune responses and alter brain signaling chemistry. Fever changes metabolic demand, while inflammatory molecules can affect vessel diameter and local neuronal function. Each of these shifts nudges perception's tight balance. For most, those changes are minor and never break into awareness. For a minority, the result is sudden-sized distortions or warped visual environments lasting minutes or hours. As unsettling as these reports are, they point to a reassuring truth. Perception generally recovers. Once the infection resolves and blood flow normalizes, children return to ordinary sight and sound. This resilience underscores how dynamic perception is, vulnerable to disruption, but capable of restabilizing quickly. The episodes serve as reminders not only of the fragility of sensory systems, but also of the brain's capacity to restore coherence after transient challenges. For neuroscience, infection-linked cases reveal an often overlooked dimension: the role of ordinary, temporary processes in producing extraordinary subjective experiences. Hallucinations in this light are not always exotic symptoms, but sometimes byproducts of the same fluctuations every brain undergoes. The difference is one of degree rather than category. Infections amplify the fluctuations enough to make the constructed nature of perception visible. In the wider understanding of AIWS, infections thus represent an important piece, but only one among several. They show that perception does not require dramatic pathology to bend. Even familiar viruses can make the ordinary world appear skewed. But distortions do not occur at random. They emerge in recognizable brain systems responsible for mapping space, perspective, and body size. And it is those very systems, normally seamless and invisible, that form the next part of the story about how the brain keeps track of where and what you are. The brain's spatial mapping error. How does the brain mislead you into feeling your body is the wrong size while you still know, rationally, it hasn't changed? This puzzle takes researchers directly to the parietal cortex, an area near the crown of the head that acts like the body's internal GPS. Its constant job is to generate spatial maps, constructing where your body is located and how it fits into the environment. These maps allow you to reach for a cup without knocking it over, or step through a doorway without catching your shoulder. In daily life, the process is so reliable and automatic that you barely notice it. But in Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, these normally seamless calculations can misfire, creating skewed maps that make hands, legs, and even entire rooms feel stretched or compressed. The parietal lobe's function extends beyond simple location tracking. It integrates information from multiple sensory channels, vision, touch, and balance, into a single, coherent model of the body in space. Think of raising your arm. Your eyes report its position, feedback from muscles reports tension, and your inner ear tracks balance. The parietal system combines all this into certainty. My arm is above my head. But if distortions disrupt that integration, as they do in AIWS, the signals misalign. The result may be the uncanny sense of a limb shrinking below its true size or extending impossibly long. Neuroanatomical reviews and imaging studies point toward one especially important intersection: the temporoparietal occipital junction (TPOC). This hub combines visual streams with body schema representation. Dysfunction here, along with broader parietal instability, is commonly implicated in AIWS. For instance, a case fMRI recorded hyperactivation in parietal regions alongside reduced occipital responses during an episode, a pattern that fits with patients' reports of distorted dimensions. This type of evidence supports the idea that the mapping machinery is being driven out of balance rather than completely silenced. When parietal circuits spike in activity, they distort rather than erase the body map. It's like an internal GPS misreading your coordinates. Your location is still tracked, but now the system insists you're standing several meters away, or that your legs occupy more space than they do. People living through AIWS describe feet that feel gigantic or hallways that extend endlessly, even though every objective cue contradicts this. The altered maps dominate perception because they are generated inside the very networks meant to coordinate all inputs. The significance of these distortions shows up in daily navigation. Imagine repeatedly crossing your bedroom. Your brain builds a prediction of how many steps it takes. In AIWS, this forecast collapses, and suddenly the distance feels 3 times longer. The hallway hasn't changed, but the spatial coordinate system has reported it incorrectly. Crucially, higher cognitive systems often notice the mismatch. Memory and reasoning push back, saying, I've crossed here before, and it never took this long. This coexistence of distorted maps with intact recognition defines the experience. AIWS cases remind us how dynamic body awareness actually is. Most people assume bodily boundaries feel stable, yet imaging shows continuous recalibration. Every motion requires the parietal cortex to adjust spatial frames. In ordinary conditions, those updates are invisible. In AIWS, the adjustments slip off course. Instead of a quiet correction, the misalignment grows large enough to dominate consciousness. Watching a room swell around you is, in effect, witnessing your parietal system losing calibration in real time. This fragility is not unique to the syndrome. Simple examples in everyday life show how easily parietal processing can be tricked. When you look into water, a stick appears bent because light refraction fools visual input. The parietal system incorporates this skewed cue, producing a mistaken sense of where the object lies. With AIWS, the twist happens internally, not through the environment. Circuits that usually stabilize perception instead generate errors, creating distortions before you even compare them to the outside world. These errors matter because spatial mapping underlies survival. Without precise coordinates of body and environment, balance, reaching, and basic orientation would collapse. Evolution built robust parietal systems to manage these problems with speed. But episodes of AIWS reveal that robustness has limits. Patients may suddenly feel missized in their own body, a destabilizing experience that can cause lasting unease even after perceptions normalize. The resilience of the system means most episodes end quickly. Yet their intensity leaves lasting evidence that the mapping process is vulnerable. The neuroscience also reshapes how we think about self-awareness. Feeling located within a body is not automatic. It is the outcome of constant mapping activity. AIWS strips away that transparency and reveals embodiment as a construction. A hand that feels oversized or a head that seems shrunken is a signal that the system fabricating bodily presence has faltered. The brain is still generating a cohesive body image, but the scale and distances are skewed. This gap between perception and belief becomes not just a symptom, but a window into how feeling in a body is sustained to begin with. Patient reports and brain scans converge on the parietal cortex as a common locus of dysfunction, though not the only one. Occipital and temporal areas sometimes show altered blood flow too, underscoring that AIWS is heterogeneous. Still, parietal network variation appears again and again. Even tiny changes in neural timing or intensity create exaggerated impressions, forcing patients to reconcile everyday actions with wildly inaccurate maps. Practical accounts show that grounding strategies can help. Because spatial maps are multimodal, tactile input can stabilize them. Some patients find relief by pressing feet firmly to the floor, touching a textured surface, or using a mirror for feedback. These actions introduce strong sensory anchors, pulling the body map back toward accuracy. Case reports note that such grounding can shorten episodes. This coping strategy highlights how flexible and layered the system is. Visual distortion might pull it one way, touch corrects it from another. Considering all this, AIWS underscores the fragile balance of perception. Internal maps are normally seamless, but when they fall out of calibration, even for minutes, reality feels warped. That fragility is not confined to those with a syndrome diagnosis. It is a universal feature of how perception is built. Day to day, small slips in prediction or mapping pass unnoticed. In AIWS, they are magnified until impossible to ignore. The lesson is that stability of space and body is not hardwired. It is negotiated moment by parietal and connected networks. Each successful negotiation gives you the certainty you occupy a body moving through a consistent environment. Each failure demonstrates just how provisional that certainty really is. And once you recognize that perception relies on such delicate computations, another question emerges. If ordinary brain activity already hides these constant recalibrations, what does that tell us about the illusions we all accept? Ones that arise not from dysfunction, but from perception's normal shortcuts. Everyday optical illusions versus AIWS. What links the harmless amusement of an optical trick in a psychology textbook with the overwhelming disorientation of Alice in Wonderland Syndrome? Both arise from the way your brain constructs reality, rather than simply recording it. Everyday illusions give a glimpse of how perception takes shortcuts. AIWS exposes what happens when those shortcuts are stretched until they dominate your experience of the world. Consider the Muller-Lyer illusion. Two lines of equal length appear different when arrowheads are drawn in opposite directions. Your brain misreads depth cues and favors speed over accuracy. A similar trick appears in Ames rooms, where skewed walls and floors make one person seem to grow or shrink as they walk across. These illusions are simple but powerful demonstrations that the brain fills gaps with guesses shaped by expectation. Because the errors are small and easily tested against a ruler or camera, they don't threaten daily life. They remind us that perception is efficient, not precise. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome is the same mechanism writ large. Instead of a flat drawing on the page, it is your own living room that seems cavernous, or your body that shrinks until your feet appear childlike. No clever architecture or artist's diagram created the distortion. It emerges from your brain's internal systems, misfiring in the absence of external triggers. While a drawing can fool the eye for a moment, AIWS makes the distortion feel inescapable, unfolding in real environments with no vantage point to step out and reveal the trick. Everyday optical illusions and AIWS sit on a continuum of perception. They both depend on the brain's interpretation of context to create a coherent scene. The distinction is in degree and origin. Simple illusions rely on structured external cues meant to bias your interpretation. AIWS arises from within the brain's own mapping networks. A concise way to put it, everyday visual illusions and AIWS lie on a continuum of the same perceptual mechanisms. AIWS is an extreme, internally driven version, not an entirely different phenomenon. This comparison raises a practical lesson. If a line drawing can reliably fool your visual system, imagine how subtler versions of the same bias could shape events you face every day. A rushed glance at a chart, a quick impression of someone's facial expression, or a fleeting judgment about distance and traffic, all run on those same shortcuts. Unlike the classroom exercise, those interpretations may carry real consequences. The broader point is not that perception is broken, but that it favors speed over certainty, and you live with the consequences of those choices. Recognizing the difference matters, because while we laugh at line illusions, similar distortions contribute to high-stakes mistakes. Eyewitness testimony often falters as memories of an event bend around biased perception. A person may swear they saw someone's height or clothing with certainty, when in fact contextual assumptions guided what their eyes confirmed. Even skilled professionals can be vulnerable. Pilots, surgeons, or drivers sometimes misinterpret spatial cues under stress, leading to errors that are not easily laughed away. Illusions may be harmless in a classroom, but they show up in critical domains where consequences extend far beyond curiosity. So what do we do with that insight? One habit helps. Verify perception with another sense or a deliberate check before acting. In practice, that means looking away and back again before making a quick decision with visual data, or cross-checking what you see with touch, sound, or measurement. It sounds trivial, but the act of slowing down exposes the brain's shortcuts before they turn into errors. A surgeon reviews imaging twice before cutting. A driver looks both ways again, even outdoors in daylight. Small delays create much-needed friction against perceptual bias. This is the real payoff of comparing AIWS with everyday illusions. The contrast shows that perception is a construction that can betray you in ways large and small. AIWS demonstrates the extreme, opening a window into what happens when internal calibration fails. Illusions with lines and shapes show the same principle gently, in contexts safe enough to learn from. Both remind us that the brain will happily choose coherence over accuracy, and that awareness of this tendency is essential if you want to resist being misled by your own senses. These lessons extend beyond vision. Just as your brain inserts false depth into arrows, it also interprets tone of voice, pauses in conversation, or facial expressions using preloaded assumptions. You may misread a contemplative silence as disapproval, or take a neutral look as hostility. These are not errors in character so much as illusions in social perception. They echo the same cognitive shortcuts seen in optical experiments, and they re-emerge whenever humans rely on quick impressions to act. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome takes that already fragile scaffolding and makes it impossible to ignore. People living through it may watch hands or feet grow and shrink, or see hallways expand into impossible stretches. Even then, many retain insight. They know they are being fooled. That combination of distortion and recognition underlines the bigger message. Your senses do not provide unquestioned truth. They construct provisional models, and sometimes those models can diverge drastically from reality. By framing AIWS and simple illusions together, we begin to understand them as different points on the same spectrum of experience. One is fleeting, a puzzle in a classroom or museum. The other can be life-altering, forcing someone to question how they inhabit their own body. But both tell us the same thing. Our brains trade accuracy for workable models, and those models guide choices whether we notice the distortion or not. Knowing this does not mean mistrusting every signal, but it does mean treating perception as input to evaluate instead of evidence to worship. Practical grounding emerges from that shift. In moments of doubt, ask simple questions. Can another sense confirm what I'm assuming? Can a measurement or second perspective resolve uncertainty? These are the everyday equivalents of looking twice at a visual illusion. The difference is that outside controlled settings, lives and relationships, may rest on how you handle those sensory gaps. AIWS patients must learn to trust reasoning above the bent images their brains create. The rest of us benefit from the same strategy, though our distortions tend to be quieter and less obvious. The comparisons give more than insight into a rare disorder. They push you to rethink the reliability of what you ordinarily consider unquestionable. Sight, sound, and touch are not direct transmissions from the world into the mind. They are reconstructions passed through filters, edits, and shortcuts. For most of us, the edits hold steady enough to remain invisible. For AIWS patients, the edits slip just far enough to put the process on display. That visibility is what makes their experience valuable for science, and for the rest of us seeking to avoid smaller errors in daily judgment. Acknowledging the continuum also reframes what it means to act rationally. Rationality isn't trusting your senses without question. It is knowing when to slow down and check. A slight pause, an extra confirmation, or simply holding doubt in mind can shift the outcome of a decision. This lesson begins with a ruler across two drawn lines, and it continues in the choices that matter. The report you write, the street you cross, the trust you extend. And when you consider how perception shapes experience in this way, another question naturally follows. If a brain can trick itself so easily with drawings and occasionally collapse into full-scale distortions, how often might it also bias judgments in more ordinary settings, like choices, risks, or beliefs that feel obvious at first glance? That is where the story now turns. Decision-making under distorted signals. If the brain can mislead someone into feeling that a hand is shrinking or a hallway is stretching, the natural question is how often the same machinery subtly influences everyday choices. This is the heart of decision-making under distorted signals. Neuroscience makes it clear that no judgment happens in isolation. Every decision depends on streams of sensory evidence filtered through attention, memory, and expectation. If those inputs bend, even slightly, the choices built on them may point in the wrong direction. Crossing a busy street illustrates the point. You judge the speed of cars by their apparent size and motion. Under ordinary conditions, those cues are accurate enough to avoid danger. Yet even modest distortions in depth or scale can skew timing, making a car seem slower or farther away than it really is. AIWS patients live through dramatic versions of this, where scale and distance judgments twist visibly in front of them. For most people, the errors remain small and hidden, but they still steer critical decisions, whether to step off the curb or to hold back. Experimental work confirms this link between perception and choice. Studies show that simply altering sensory input nudges judgments. Dimmer lighting makes objects seem farther away, louder sounds feel closer, and manipulated visual depth shifts timing estimates. The lesson is straightforward. If perception can be pulled off balance in a controlled lab, then in everyday life minor shifts in conditions continually bias our decisions without us realizing it. This explains why the vivid distortions of AIWS serve as an illustration, not a one-to-one counterpart, for the rest of us. Patients notice the unreality of what they see, while everyday biases slip by unnoticed. Consider visual illusions in experiments. People continue to feel the effect even when they know the trick. Knowledge alone doesn't erase perceptual framing. Once the brain settles on a version of input, logic often fights uphill against it. Evolution has favored speed over perfection in these processes. Quick reactions can save lives. Absolute accuracy takes more time. But speed comes with a cost. When scanning a stranger's expression, a flat effect might be read as hostility, while a faint smile becomes warmth. These rapid appraisals shape social choices. Who seems trustworthy, who feels threatening, who earns a second chance. Most of the time, the brain's guess is good enough. Occasionally it fails, and the decision falters with it. The same vulnerability underpins errors in higher stakes environments. A driver in fog may misjudge an oncoming car as slower than it is and attempt a risky turn. A pilot landing at night might misread the runway's length based on distorted visual cues. The structure of the error is consistent. Judgments take the perceptual input at face value and act on it before logic intervenes. AIWS offers a metaphorical glimpse of this breakdown by showing perception pushed into extremes where the distortions can no longer hide. The moon illusion offers another clear example. On the horizon, the moon appears larger than overhead, though its size is unchanged. This perception subtly influences judgments of distance and scale. Carrying that unconscious bias into navigation could, in principle, alter how someone paces a walk or estimates travel time. It is not catastrophic, but it is the same structural lesson. Perception anchors decisions, and those anchors can drift. Psychology research emphasizes that these biases aren't flaws of lazy thinking, but outcomes of an efficient system. Each second, the brain receives more sensory data than it can process. To manage, it compresses, predicts, and smooths contradictions. Most of the time, that efficiency works in our favor. But the shortcuts sometimes misfire, and when they do, the judgments built upon them wobble. AIWS exposes that system with distortions large enough to make the process undeniable. Healthy individuals face the same architecture in less obvious ways. Eyewitness testimony makes the fragility visible. A person may swear that a coat was blue or a car arrived seconds later than it did, not because of dishonesty, but because memory is hosted on top of filtered, biased perception to begin with. Courts depend on these recollections, yet decades of research show how often they diverge from physical recordings. The principle is the same, one magnified in AIWS. Perception feels solid even when it is unreliable. What can be learned is not just clinical curiosity, but a broader strategy for decision-making. Patients with AIWS describe distorted objects while acknowledging they are false. That preserved insight shows a safeguard, the ability to hold perception and belief apart. Ordinary individuals can imitate that buffer by adopting a habit of momentary skepticism. Pausing to ask, "Is my first impression complete?" introduces space to test perception before acting on it. Finance offers a practical place to see this. A steep incline on a stock chart may provoke urgency to buy or sell, but the slope is created by the graph's scaling choices. The image exaggerates the story. Investors who recognize that their visual perception inflates the sense of urgency make comma choices. Here the principle mirrors AIWS. Acknowledge what perception presents, but resist letting it dictate the belief unchallenged. The same applies to risk in everyday life. Before assuming someone's tone indicates anger, or that a ladder feels unsafe because it wobbles slightly, a simple cross-check helps. Recall past experiences, test with touch, or ask for another perspective. A quick behavioral strategy follows from this. If perception triggers a consequential decision, pause 3 to 5 seconds and verify with another sense, with memory, or by seeking a second opinion. The pause rarely costs much time, but can prevent errors born from shortcuts. AIWS's value is not that it mirrors all perceptual bias directly, but that it illustrates perception's instability in unmistakable ways. It reminds us that senses are filters, not mirrors. Every decision passes through those filters. Awareness of their limits builds room to adjust. At its core, the shrinking hand or stretching hallway becomes a metaphor for what unfolds in everyone's mind. Perception constructs reality quickly and sometimes misshapes it. Recognizing this fact does not mean distrusting every signal, but it does warrant slowing down, cross-checking, and pausing before committing to consequential judgments. Seen this way, AIWS does not only shed light on rare hallucinations, it helps frame ordinary life choices where perception's edits are subtler. By watching its exaggerated distortions, we are reminded that vision, sound, and touch all lean toward coherence at the expense of accuracy. We live inside those edits every day, but usually they hide in plain sight. And once you become aware of how fragile that scaffolding is, you start to notice the places it veers toward the absurd. In those moments, what might first seem unsettling or uncanny can also take on a different quality. Sometimes the distortions sound almost comical in their mismatch with reality, and that mix of strangeness and levity offers its own kind of lesson about how much, or how little, our senses can be trusted. The humor in hallucination. Imagine stepping into your own hallway and feeling as though it stretches on for miles. In Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, that's not metaphor, it's a reported experience. Some patients describe bedrooms expanding like ballrooms or entire hallways elongating into tunnels. The result often carries an unintended comic edge. Someone might hesitate, debating whether they'll need trekking poles just to reach their kitchen. They know the hallway hasn't changed, but the exaggeration itself can be awkwardly funny. Accounts in medical literature include distortions that sound as if they belong in a surreal comedy. Feet appear proportionally too large to step through a doorway, or a head feels tiny against the rest of the body. Rooms tilt as though borrowed from a carnival funhouse. A child once told a doctor the window frames in their house slanted sideways during an episode, shifting back into place within minutes. Another detail reported at the University of Nebraska Medical Center involved a boy who carried a pocket mirror so he could check his reflection whenever objects or faces warped. To him, the mirror acted as a quick test of reality. The image he saw of his own face reminded him that the world hadn't really fallen apart. The practicality of the trick, and its childlike inventiveness, adds levity to what could otherwise be frightening. The humor isn't that the distortions are safe or pleasant. Most patients find them bewildering or disorienting in the moment. But laughter arises when impossible images appear inside ordinary settings. Imagine sitting at the dinner table and lifting a fork, only to perceive the utensil expand across the entire plate. Or hearing a parent's voice suddenly shift in pitch until it no longer fits the person speaking. Looking back, the mismatch between the seriousness of perception and the absurdity of its content becomes almost cartoonish. The laughter softens the fear, but also points to a deeper truth. Our senses can look convincing and still be wrong. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome dramatizes a lesson that illusions and magic tricks already hint at. Perception prioritizes coherence over accuracy. With illusions slipped into everyday space, patients realize that even the most routine surroundings can suddenly turn strange. That shift, though disruptive, often gets retold with humor later, once the disorientation fades. An important factor is that patients usually retain awareness through the episode. Unlike psychotic hallucinations, which may convince someone entirely, AIWS leaves cognitive judgment intact. A teenager watching their bed appear to lengthen knows their sheets aren't stretching like taffy. That insight permits reflection and even joking later. My bed tried to become a runway last night. The ability to laugh about it underscores how awareness preserves some control. Humor becomes a coping strategy layered onto the episode itself. The comic quality is sharpened by contrast with the ordinariness of the environments involved. Checking notes at school becomes impossible if the lines on a page curl into waves. Leaning back from a slanted doorway becomes instinctive, even if the distortion lasts only seconds. Recounting these stories, patients describe situations that could double as slapstick routines. Tripping over giant shoes, backing away from tilted door frames. But at the same time, they remind listeners that even slight perceptual twists command immediate respect. For a brief moment, the body reacts to what feels real, regardless of knowledge. That push and pull, the serious response to a comic distortion, creates the unique tone of AIWS accounts. They're strange and at times unsettling, but also oddly entertaining. In some instances, families share routines around them. A child might alert a parent that the windows are crooked again, and after reassurance, laugh at how bizarre the scene seemed. The mix of exasperation and humor mirrors daily life, just with perception itself as the unreliable narrator. The stories also encourage humility. If perception can make a classroom wall tilt as though it's part of a funhouse, then the rest of us should be cautious about trusting sight and sound too readily. The joke of a 3-mile hallway hides a reminder about the fragility of sensory trust. By laughing at distortions, patients also underscore that belief doesn't have to follow perception, that people can observe, resist, and even mock their own misjudging senses. That balance between levity and reflection is crucial. The humor doesn't trivialize the syndrome. Instead, it transforms discomfort into perspective. A patient who recalls checking their reflection with a pocket mirror while the world warped around them isn't simply telling a funny anecdote. They're showing how humor and logic intertwine to regain control. The joke is real, but so is the coping. Both sides carry lessons about resilience in the face of unreliable signals. The collected tone of these accounts helps researchers and audiences engage with what could otherwise feel alien. Hearing that a child brought a mirror everywhere to verify their surroundings is both amusing and immediately human. It highlights the creativity that brains and people summon when confronted with disorienting experiences. Humor, in this way, offers entry into empathy. By inviting a smile, the distortion becomes easier to understand, not as an abstract neurological failure, but as a daily moment someone learns to navigate with wit. What lingers after the laughter is the realization that perception rests on shaky ground. Beds don't really grow, door frames don't bend, and hands don't balloon into giant mitts. But the brain can announce them as if they do, and in those moments, the certainty feels convincing. Laughter helps defuse the tension, but it also confirms the larger lesson. We are all vulnerable to sensory systems that bend reality. The difference for AIWS patients is that the bending grows dramatic enough to become undeniably visible. The humor of AIWS thus works in layers. First, it emerges directly from the absurdity of distortions. Too large shoes, wandering walls, a face double-checked by a mirror. Second, it provides a strategy for patients and families to live alongside the disorder without surrendering to fear. Finally, it opens a reflective angle for everyone else. If perception can produce images both false and funny, then maybe the foundation of certainty in our own senses needs to be reconsidered. Accounts of people laughing at their distorted memories often prepare us to hear the next difficult detail with more openness. Humor and humility combine to keep the syndrome comprehensible. And many of the most valuable insights researchers and clinicians now draw about the condition come directly from patient stories. Not just the distortions, but the inventive ways people choose to retell them. It's that lived detail, the hallway stretched into absurdity, the pocket mirror used as a safeguard, the ordinary turned laughable, that shifts AIWS reports out of medical jargon and into experience. These small moments bridge the gap between comic disruption and clinical fact. They show resilience as much as fragility, making sense of a disorder that bends reality without erasing awareness. And it's in those recollections, wrapped in both humor and unease, that we can sense a quieter strength. By exposing distortion and laughing at it, patients reclaim agency over how the story will be remembered. That duality, between the comic and the unsettling, sets the stage for what comes next. The more detailed case accounts that show what it's like to face these distortions day after day and still carry on with ordinary routines. Case studies, when reality plays tricks. When the distortions of Alice in Wonderland Syndrome are described in detail, the reality of living with them becomes more concrete. Clinical case reports provide glimpses into how ordinary environments can turn unstable, yet also show how patients adapt. These documented accounts are particularly valuable because they combine vivid personal descriptions with measured evidence from imaging studies. In one pediatric series published in 1998, researchers used SPECT scans to examine 4 children experiencing AIWS after upper respiratory infections. 3 of the 4 had Epstein-Barr virus, and their symptoms included tilted rooms and upside-down television screens. The imaging revealed reduced blood flow in areas involved in processing vision, sometimes in occipital regions, sometimes in temporal cortex. While the exact site varied, the shared feature was hypoperfusion near pathways that normally stabilize visual input. The reports made clear that the children knew their surroundings hadn't literally changed, which aligns with the preserved insight that defines the syndrome. These cases placed objective findings beside subjective experiences, creating a rare window into how infection can lead momentarily to distorted maps of space. Another striking case comes from 2010, when clinicians conducted an fMRI study of a child with pronounced micropsia, perceiving objects as smaller than they were. As the child viewed shapes that seemed to shrink before their eyes, activity spiked in parietal regions associated with spatial mapping, while dropping in occipital areas that construct the primary visual picture. This unusual combination of hyperactivation and hypoactivation suggested the distortion emerged not from a collapse of vision, but from faulty recalibration between perception and spatial context. The imaging reinforced what the child already reported. Things looked wrong, even though they knew those impressions couldn't be real. The objective scans, tied directly to the subjective account, offered rare confirmation that perceptual distortion is not imagined exaggeration, but a measurable brain state. Patient-centered accounts also add human detail unreachable by imaging alone. A clinical report from the University of Nebraska Medical Center described a boy whose symptoms included hallways stretching into tunnels and faces in conversation appearing misshapen. To cope, he began carrying a pocket mirror everywhere. Whenever the world appeared distorted, he glanced at his reflection to reassure himself of scale and orientation. If his face remained normal, he knew the rest of the distortion was false. This simple strategy provided stability during episodes. His habit wasn't theoretical. It was learned experience applied in the moment. Such examples highlight how coping strategies emerge intuitively from the need to test perception against consistent evidence. These strategies are echoed across other documented cases. Patients often ground themselves by touching objects of known size, rubbing fingers together to reaffirm tactile consistency, or counting steps to anchor space when environments visually expand. Commonly reported tactics include looking at mirrors, focusing on familiar textures, or slowing down movements until perception recalibrates. Each is a straightforward act of cross-checking one sense against another. Like the boy's pocket mirror, they provide external feedback that perception alone cannot guarantee. Published reports emphasize how effective such reality checks can be in shortening the length of episodes. Living with AIWS often means layering logic on top of perception in order to keep ordinary activities manageable. One child was reported to avoid spilling during meals by focusing on the sound of liquid hitting a cup rather than trusting his distorted sense of scale. Others slowed texting or writing by carefully verifying each keystroke instead of relying on distorted motor maps. A teacher living with episodic distortions reportedly continued lecturing in class by focusing on memory of where her students were seated, rather than the stretching or wobbling she perceived. Such adaptations, though modest, show resilience in the face of unstable sensory signals. Psychologists point out that most hallucination-related conditions undermine insight, while AIWS commonly preserves it. Patients are not confused about the physical world. They recognize that what they see or hear is an error in their perception. This coexistence gives them leverage. They can delay pouring cereal, pause before stepping forward, or steady themselves on a desk, all while acknowledging the unreality of their experience. For clinicians, this quality makes AIWS distinctive. For patients, it means maintaining some control even when perception bends away from reality. Beyond coping, finding humor in the distortions appears to reduce their emotional weight. One child reported a dog appearing stretched like a cartoon character, and later retold the event with laughter rather than anxiety. Another commented on shoes that seemed comically oversized, joking afterward about needing clown feet to walk. These responses show reframing at work. Seeing episodes not only as disruptive, but also as absurd, helps blunt their threat. By treating the bizarre as temporary spectacle, patients reinforce their ability to coexist with it. Resilience across these cases is not about eliminating episodes, but about stabilizing life around them. Whether through mirrors, tactile checks, auditory cues, or humor, people create personal systems to navigate situations when their senses falter. The lesson for clinicians is that functional strategies exist even without medication. Behavior itself becomes treatment. The lesson for audiences is that human adaptation can extend even into areas as destabilizing as distorted perception. Case studies also underscore the variability of triggers. Some children experience episodes only briefly following infection, then recover without recurrence. Others encounter distortions linked to migraines or seizures. A portion show no clear trigger at all. The diversity of origins makes AIWS difficult to pin down, but it also points to a shared final pathway: instabilities in networks that integrate vision, space, and body awareness. Whether from hypoperfusion, hyperactivation, or miscommunication between regions, the result is the same: perception loses calibration. The blend of imaging data and patient coping strategies makes the research both scientific and deeply human. The scans demonstrate measurable changes in blood flow and neural activity. The patient reports show how individuals respond in ordinary environments: classrooms, kitchens, conversations with friends. Together, they create a full picture of how AIWS bends reality and how people steady themselves against it. The significance of these case studies extends beyond their medical rarity. They reveal the flexibility of the human mind under pressure and illustrate that awareness itself can be a tool. Patients leverage cognition, memory, and humor to hold their ground when perception drifts. That ability to juggle frames of reference, one rooted in distortion, the other in reason, marks resilience not only clinically but philosophically. The importance for a broader audience lies in the insight that perception, even when it feels absolute, is vulnerable. If children recovering from infection can watch rooms tilt while still knowing the coffee stays level in the cup, then everyone should consider how fragile sensory evidence is. These examples draw attention to the fact that perception can lie convincingly, and that functioning depends on tools to resist being swept away. By studying these cases, we see more than an unusual syndrome. We see the strategies, creativity, and flexibility that arise when reality itself turns unstable. And that realization brings us to a larger reflection. When people live daily with the fact that their senses can mislead, what does that teach about the reliability of perception for the rest of us? What AIWS teaches all of us? Alice in Wonderland Syndrome highlights a striking position. Its patients live with undeniable proof that perception is not always trustworthy. Their senses generate distortions that feel immediate and convincing, while their reasoning mind resists believing them. For those of us who do not experience the syndrome, this remains an important lesson. What AIWS makes visible in dramatic form, perception as a construction vulnerable to error, is the same process shaping every ordinary experience we rely on daily. The core takeaway is simple to state yet far-reaching in practice. Perception is a construction. The brain does not transmit the world directly. It compiles fragments of input into a coherent, usable model. What appears stable, the sizes of objects, the continuity of space, the tone of a voice, is actually stitched together through shortcuts. In AIWS, the errors swell large enough to expose the seams. That exposure is valuable precisely because it reveals the scaffolding the rest of us normally miss. And that recognition carries practical weight. Consider a meeting in which someone misinterprets a neutral expression as disapproval. Perception triggers a reaction, defensiveness, altered plans, a hesitation that changes the flow of conversation. Here, a pause could reframe the outcome. If perception were assumed to be provisional, and therefore something to test, another explanation could emerge. Perhaps the expression signals concentration or fatigue instead of anger. When learned, the habit of questioning surface impressions changes the shape of choices. These lessons extend outward from raw sensation. Memory, for instance, draws on the same constructive process. It feels like a record, but operates more like a story retold each time, subject to editing. Decades of cognitive science confirm how even confident eyewitnesses misremember details. The mismatch between what feels certain and what actually occurred mirrors the experiences of AIWS patients. What is immediate is not always accurate. Awareness of memory's constructive nature guards against certainty that risks becoming error. For practical life, applying this awareness translates into a discipline of verification. Perception will always offer a first impression, but the next step is optional. Do we act instantly, or do we allow time to check? Cross-checks can be small but decisive. Counting steps in a dark hall, seeking another perspective in conversation, or asking for clarification before assuming intent all create buffers against error. The principle is the same as the child with AIWS consulting a pocket mirror. Reality testing, even briefly, anchors judgment. This discipline can be described in one compact action. Before a consequential decision, ask, is this perception based on one quick sense? Can I cross-check it? In ordinary life, this means pausing before interpreting tone, hesitating before spending money based on a persuasive graph, or reconsidering a memory that feels unshakably vivid. Each step enforces the principle that perception deserves confirmation rather than blind acceptance. This framework mirrors strategies developed naturally by AIWS patients, but scales down into habits everyone can use. There is a critical caveat worth emphasizing. While AIWS produces extreme distortions, the scientific literature confirms that everyday perception is governed by the same constructive processes. Ordinary vision, sound, and memory all depend on the blending of inputs and predictions. The rare syndrome highlights the edge cases, but the underlying lessons apply in subtler form across daily judgments. What makes AIWS valuable is not only its rarity, but its power to reveal the machinery all of us live by. Humility grows naturally from this understanding. If even the most apparently solid impressions, rooms, limbs, voices, can bend under certain conditions, then claims to certainty in more ambiguous domains deserve restraint. Humility does not forbid action. It shapes action with awareness. Decisions are stronger when guided by the recognition that inputs may shift beneath them. What seems absolute today may yield tomorrow to contrary evidence. AIWS frames that fragility not as weakness, but as a condition of human experience. The lesson widens further into empathy. If perception varies between people at baseline, then disagreement often reflects differences in construction rather than dishonesty. Two people may interpret the same tone of voice or body language in conflicting ways, yet be sincerely accurate within their own perceptual filters. AIWS offers a metaphor. A child sees walls tilting, while the parent standing beside them sees nothing. Both are reporting real experiences from their standpoint. Extending that awareness to ordinary disagreements makes room for patience in place of hostility. Every field where judgment relies on perception can benefit from this reminder. Doctors listening to symptom descriptions, drivers gauging distance at speed, teachers interpreting a student's attitude, all lean on perceptual inputs that are not infallible. Treating those inputs as powerful, but provisional, reduces overconfidence. It encourages confirmatory strategies, second opinions, measurements, alternative viewpoints. This practical humility closes the gap between what is felt immediately and what deserves to guide important action. For audiences interested in spiritual or transformational themes, AIWS provides a particularly relevant lens. Spiritual intuition, dream imagery, or sudden insights can feel as vivid as sensory inputs. The same principle applies. Vividness alone does not guarantee accuracy. Here, the lesson of AIWS offers a discipline. Use grounding practices, such as journaling, physical activity, or conversations with trusted community, as checks against acting too quickly on powerful but untested impressions. In this way, transformed awareness honors its immediacy while still anchoring in reality. The philosophical point still carries weight, but it becomes sharper when grounded in action. Recognizing perception as constructed means accepting that reality is always mediated, never raw. But this is not reason for despair. It reframes each experience as both signal and story, something to attend to carefully and, when significant, to verify before acting. The constructed nature of perception does not reduce its richness. It simply places responsibility on reasoning to engage actively with what seems true. The same recognition has long been echoed in culture. Illusions in art and architecture, from Renaissance perspective paintings to street murals designed to skew depth, play with perception's assumptions. They demonstrate that we have always intuited the malleability of sight. AIWS, by contrast, creates unchosen illusions embedded in daily life. By comparing cultural playfulness with clinical extremes, the message is reinforced. Perception is not passive recording but active interpretation, and interpretation is subject to error. What AIWS teaches us, then, is not confined to clinical interest. It models a skill that is universally applicable, the ability to separate perception from belief, and to act on that separation. For patients, it comes as necessity, a survival tool against destabilizing distortions. For the rest of us, it can be cultivated deliberately. Each pause to question, each cross-check before a significant choice, strengthens the reliability of judgment. The cumulative effect is practical resilience built on cognitive clarity. This reframing makes decision-making more deliberate and relationships more understanding. It prevents mistakes born of perceptual bias and encourages humility about certainty. Most of all, it provides a tool simple enough to carry into any context. A quick pause, a cross-check with another sense, another viewpoint, or another memory. The wisdom lies in acknowledging construction without being trapped by it. AIWS demonstrates this vividly. We can borrow its lesson without living through its extremes. By internalizing these lessons, construction, humility, empathy, verification, ordinary decisions gain stability. The disorder may be rare, but its teaching is broad. Whether managing a business choice, navigating a relationship, interpreting an intuition, or reflecting on memory, the principle remains the same. Perception presents drafts, not final truths. Accepting that gives us freedom to act with more care and fewer errors. This perspective reshapes not only how we view choices today, but also how we imagine the possibilities of studying perception tomorrow. The cases of AIWS act as reminders of the hidden complexity built into the most ordinary experiences. When science turns to these distortions, it is not only treating a rare condition, but uncovering principles that shape everyone's reality. As the research continues, the questions reach beyond symptoms into the fundamentals of how the mind builds the world around us. Looking ahead, the future of reality research. In looking to the future, researchers treating Alice in Wonderland Syndrome see not only a rare condition worth understanding, but a testing ground for bigger questions about how brains construct experience. By early 2025, the field still sits in its early stages, gathering small but meaningful observations and trying to capture episodes in real time. The evidence so far points to patterns: brief episodes linked with viral infections, migraine activity, or unusual dynamics of blood flow across visual and parietal regions. Those immediate findings already tell us something about the syndrome, but the deeper promise may be what it reveals about the guiding systems that decide what reality looks like from one moment to the next. That phrasing matters. Rather than suggesting AIWS will soon solve the mystery of consciousness, the more measured view is that it may offer fresh clues about the architecture of perception and how higher-order awareness evaluates sensory signals. Each episode reflects a patterned misalignment rather than random chaos. Rooms tilt to the side, not at random angles, but in consistent manners across different cases. Body parts expand or shrink in recognizable ways. These recurrent structures suggest underlying neural networks being pushed off balance, and careful study of that misalignment could illuminate how the same systems perform under healthy conditions. The future of this research doesn't rest with one field. The most intriguing directions sit at the crossroads of psychology, neurology, immunology, and philosophy. Psychology documents lived accounts, tracking how patients describe distortions in everyday language. Neurology contributes the physiological context, noting hypoperfusion in occipital areas or hyperactivation in parietal cortex. Immunology may explain why an infection appears to set episodes into motion, highlighting inflammatory changes or transient vascular shifts. Philosophy keeps the spotlight on what it means to hold two realities at once, one insisted upon by the senses, the other protected by awareness. It is precisely in the overlap of these disciplines that AIWS becomes more than a curiosity and instead serves as a model for how different systems collide inside one condition. From a practical standpoint, the next step will be capturing these fleeting events with better precision. Clinicians already report success in using functional imaging like fMRI or SPECT, but technology in 2025 allows higher resolution and faster sampling. If an episode can be recorded as it unfolds, showing the moment when a hallway stretches or a hand shrinks, then researchers gain not just correlation but dynamic evidence. Researchers are pursuing these paths, tracking activation and blood flow in real time to watch perception destabilize and recalibrate within minutes. That ability could help clarify not only which areas misfire, but the sequence in which disruptions move across networks. Does visual cortex misinterpret first, or does a parietal miscalibration lead the way? Better imaging may give answers. Another track is identifying the biological underpinnings that set the stage for these distortions in the first place. Multidisciplinary teams are already examining links between infection effects, migraine-related cortical spreading depression, and thalamocortical dysrhythmia. Each of these mechanisms can create disruptions in timing and coordination across networks, which may explain why patients alternate between accuracy and distortion. Researchers are pursuing this integration because AIWS seems to sit at the intersection of several vulnerabilities: vascular flow, immune activation, and sensory coordination. Mapping these factors together may produce not a single cause, but a system-level explanation for how ordinary inputs become warped. Shorter-term goals still matter for patients experiencing the condition. Trials in non-invasive neuromodulation, such as targeted neurostimulation of parietal areas, have been suggested in pilot work as a way to stabilize mapping signals. Behavioral strategies, like introducing grounding cues or deliberately engaging multiple senses, also stand out as low-risk interventions worth refining. Patients already describe how mirrors, touch, and memory reduce distress during episodes. Turning those coping instincts into structured therapeutic plans represents another near-future project. Once documented systematically, such strategies can be shared across clinicians and families. But AIWS research extends well beyond symptom relief. It offers a stage for testing ideas about how the brain verifies or resists its own perceptions. In schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, once a hallucination appears, belief often follows. In AIWS, an opposite pattern emerges. The hallucination is strong, but belief resists. Philosophers of mind note this separation as evidence of layered awareness, a system experiencing one thing while another system evaluates and partly overrides it. If future work uncovers which networks sustain this evaluative capacity, Those findings may be translated into techniques to help in conditions where insight is lost. AIWS, in that sense, becomes a proof of possibility that perception and belief can run on separate tracks. Equally significant are the cultural implications. Hallucination continues to be a stigmatized word, bound up with fear and associations of permanent mental illness. AIWS shows that hallucinations can occur in healthy children or adults, sometimes for days or weeks, often without long-term consequences. They appear, they fade, and the person continues with daily life. As these cases receive more attention, public understanding may shift to see hallucinations not as alien phenomena, but as extremes of a process all brains share. Recasting hallucination this way redirects conversations in psychiatry and society alike, helping people recognize that distorted perception is not exclusively pathological, but part of the brain's broader range of operations. On a longer horizon, AIWS provides data for integrating hallucination research with everyday illusion studies. Future experiments will likely compare patients who perceive their limbs shrunk with healthy participants misjudging the size of identical shapes in the Muller-Lyer illusion. Brain activity across such cases can reveal common structures handling scale and context. If the same parietal and occipital systems fire differently in each scenario, researchers gain clear evidence that these distortions exist along a continuum. Such findings would help explain not just rare disorders, but also the subtle perceptual biases underpinning normal decision-making. Another spillover may reach into technological domains. Artificial intelligence systems designed to perceive their environments face many of the same problems the human brain solves, integrating noisy and incomplete inputs into stable predictive models. When those systems fail, as in AIWS, humans can watch the brain produce errors, correct them, and return to functional output. Studying this kind of fault detection and recalibration could suggest strategies for machine learning, where algorithms must manage uncertainty without escalating small errors into total misclassification. The interplay between neuroscience and technology becomes reciprocal. Insights about AIWS feed into design principles, while simulations in artificial systems sharpen hypotheses about human perception. All of this returns to a central theme. AIWS does not solve the riddle of consciousness. It would be overstated to imagine it as a key to the entire problem. What it does provide is a small but revealing window into the layered architecture of awareness. By showing how a person can see one reality while believing another, AIWS maps the seam where perception and belief separate. That seam may not disclose why subjective experience exists at all, but it offers an empirical foothold for exploring how brains manage competing realities. AIWS is a guidepost, not a solution, in the search to understand consciousness. The next practical steps remain clear. Researchers need larger samples, systematic tracking, and standardized methods for capturing fleeting episodes. The syndrome's rarity makes progress slow, but the rarity simultaneously underscores its importance. Each documented case becomes highly valuable evidence. As imaging improves and collaborations widen across neurology, immunology, psychology, and computational modeling, the piecemeal insights will accumulate into clearer models. These models may not only inform treatment, but also reframe how reliable perception is assumed to be. Viewed this way, Alice in Wonderland Syndrome stands less as an oddity of neurology and more as a natural experiment falling into scientists' laps, one that helps define the fragile boundaries between appearance and truth. Its value lies not in offering quick answers, but in stretching the questions to include vulnerabilities most of us live with invisibly every day. The invitation is to think not only about rare children reporting tilted windows, but also about our own reliance on senses that can misjudge with quiet persistence. And perhaps this leads to a wider reflection. If perception is a construction, what role should humility play in our spiritual and moral choices? That question lingers after the science, because the same humility that helps manage misleading perceptions can also guide decisions in other areas of life. It is with this in mind that Alice in Wonderland Syndrome serves as both medical reality and philosophical reminder. By examining its distortions, researchers refine the science. By listening to its stories, audiences glimpse their own vulnerability to error. Both directions converge on a single realization that prepares us for the conclusion of this discussion. Alice in Wonderland Syndrome makes it clear that perception is usually reliable enough for daily life, but not infallible. The brain builds a version of reality that works most of the time, yet episodes of distortion show how fragile that construction can be. Recognizing its limits helps sharpen judgment. The practical takeaway is straightforward. Before a consequential decision, pause and ask, am I relying on one quick impression, or can I cross-check this? That small habit mirrors how patients steady themselves when their senses mislead. If you've ever had a wild perceptual moment, share it in the comments. And if this resonated, like and subscribe for more episodes connecting neuroscience to everyday transformation.